These internal issues were exacerbated by the company's poor strategy and lack of foresight about the direction of the automobile market. In the past 2 years, as gasoline prices increased, General Motors was left with an inventory of SUVs which people were unwilling to purchase. Now, why was it in this position? Well, other automakers like Toyota and Honda gradually introduced fuel-efficient cars into their fleets. So, when gasoline prices rose this year and people stopped buying sport utility vehicles and light trucks, they had an ample supply of cars ready to sell these consumers. Now, years ago, General Motors realized that sport utility vehicles had higher margins than their typical cars. So, instead of focusing on fuel-efficient vehicles, General Motors increased its production capacity for light trucks. Now, this was great when oil prices were low and people were purchasing SUVs. They made great profits. But as soon as the market turned against them, General Motors did not have the capacity to respond. They lacked the foresight to have a fleet of fuel-efficient vehicles ready. They're constantly behind the innovation curve. When its competitors had vehicles ready for sale when customers wanted them, General Motors was stuck with inventory it couldn't get rid of and didn't have a good plan for introducing fuel-efficient cars until a few years later, when the market would have already moved past them. Even before SUVs began to fall out of favor, General Motors cars and trucks were mired in outdated and outmoded designs. This was evident in quality ratings, as foreign manufacturers were able to deliver higher quality vehicles for lower prices. This encouraged people to explore foreign competitors, and in order to lure people back, General Motors tried to offer generous customer incentives, like employee pricing or zero APR financing. For a while, these strategies were very successful. Customers loved the employee pricing and the discounts they offered. However, because General Motors had such a high cost structure, these incentives actually caused them to barely break even or lose money on most of the vehicles they sold with these incentives. The 0% financing was especially damaging because even if vehicles were sold at a slight loss, often the company could recoup some profits through its financing wing. Once this was removed, the vehicles were completely unprofitable. And to make matters even worse, customers became conditioned to employee pricing and 0% APR offers. So, as the company phased them out, customers simply stopped buying their cars and would wait until the company became desperate and reinstituted the incentives again. Basically, they conditioned their customers to look for these rock-bottom prices, and when they weren't delivered, customers would look elsewhere to foreign companies which offered cars at more competitive prices. Now that we've examined the internal contributors to GM's financial problems, let's look at some of the external factors, including changing customer values, foreign competition, financial collapse, and rising fuel prices. As I mentioned before, foreign competition and rising fuel prices changed the dynamic for General Motors. Foreign car companies could produce cars more cheaply, with higher fuel efficiency, and sell them in the domestic market while GM had an inventory of aging SUVs. Now, the rise of foreign manufacturers and their ability to produce higher quality vehicles has been exhausted elsewhere, so I'm not going to cover that in great detail. Suffice to say, though, the rise in fuel prices and the increase in foreign competition from competitors like Toyota, Kia, Hyundai, and German manufacturers on the luxury end, like BMW and Mercedes, have greatly contributed to the drop in demand for General Motors' old, more outdated vehicles. The final external factor to affect General Motors is our recent economic collapse. All U.S. auto sales are down by 30% in the month of October, and GM has been particularly hurt. Its sales have plunged by 45%. A comparison of GM's stock price in 2008 to the S&P 500 index is particularly instructive. Even as the S&P 500 has lost over 30% of its value since January, GM stock has lost over 80% of its value. This has reduced its market capitalization to minuscule levels and prompted talks of mergers with the similarly ailing Chrysler Company. As the global credit crisis batters markets around the world, a struggling company like General Motors sees all of its issues magnified. Our current recession magnifies all of the problems GM is facing. the recession makes it more difficult for consumers to afford to purchase new cars. So it's harder for GM to increase its sales volume and generate the cash it needs to avoid bankruptcy. It also makes other solutions like mergers and strategic alliances less effective for the same reasons. That leaves GM with one more potential alternative to bankruptcy, and that is a government bailout. We'll examine all of the issues surrounding the bailout next and look at why it may or may not be granted by our Congress.